Joining us now, the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, Evelyn Farkas. Evelyn, thanks for joining us. Russia is blaming Ukrainian drones for the second attack on this key Russian air base in a month. What does this tell you about Ukraine's strategy at this critical stage of the war?
Well, Wolf, it tells me that the Ukrainians are going to go after legitimate Russian military targets inside of Russia, which they should do. And they're not going to be essentially deterred, self-deterred, or deterred by Russia's bombastic language or references to nuclear forces. And I think that is exactly what they have to do, given the dire circumstances the Russians have put them in.
Putin on Sunday, as you know, said he's ready to negotiate with Ukraine, but in new comments, the Russian foreign minister said Ukraine has to fulfill Russia's demands or, and I'm quoting now, the Russian army will take matters into its own hands. How do you read these comments?
Right. I mean, look, Wolf, this Russian President Putin, he does not intend to compromise with the Ukrainians. Sure, he would like peace on his terms. That's essentially what they're saying. There's nothing new here. I think we'll know if the Russians really want peace under terms that are acceptable to the Ukrainians, because Russian troops will start withdrawing from the territory of Ukraine. We have not seen that. We have not seen the Russians, except for some, Christmas amnesty that you and Will just mentioned. We have not seen any ceasefire, any stop in, again, the barrage of artillery against the Ukrainian people, the 9 million or so people living without electricity, not to mention, of course, all the horrible other things the Russian military has done on the ground there in Ukraine.
All this comes, Evelyn, as you know, just after Putin apparently misspoke and called this a, quote, war, after 10 months of calling this a, quote, special military operation and telling the Russian people you'll go to jail if you actually call it a war. How significant is that?
Well, it's very interesting. I guess I am curious whether it was a statement or intentional. It's certainly caused him some trouble with those folks that he's put in jail for calling it a war. And of course, we know many high visibility dissidents, people who have been on your program, who have spoken Russians who are in jail now because they called it a war. And so many people, went on Twitter and said, well, my friend got 7 years for calling it a war. Vladimir Putin should get 7 years. I think it's causing him trouble with people, of course, who are opposed to the regime. So it's not going to really change much in Russia. But I think with the over time, the economic squeeze on Russia, and if the Ukrainians can do more to make the Russian military feel unsafe and insecure inside of Russia, that could eventually lead to even some kind of political change.
As you know, Evelyn, February will mark 1 year since Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine. What do you expect in the coming weeks just ahead of that grim milestone?
Well, Putin will probably find some way to bring up, that he's trying to save, Ukrainians or Russian-speaking Ukrainians from the West, and I think that's why he called it a war. Probably he slipped up a little bit because he saw the picture of President Biden with President Zelensky, and he thought, I could probably get, if it was deliberate, he was probably thinking, well, I can get away with calling it a war now, maybe, if he can pin it on the United States. So he will point to the United States, to NATO. He will try to deflect attention from the suffering of the Russian people, of the Russian military, of their poor performance. And of course, in Ukraine, they will continue to do everything they can to keep their spirits up and to keep the Ukrainian people safe. One last thing I want to say is that Vladimir Putin really would love nothing more than a refugee crisis again in Europe. So that's something we need to really watch out for, and we need to help the Ukrainian people avoid that.
Evelyn Farkas, let's stay in touch. Thank you very much for joining us.